For those that don't know me, my name is Wei Fen, and I'm a business anthropologist. So that's a bit of a weird title for someone in qualitative research. I think that's quite a new thing. I just want to get a show of hands. How many people know about the Culture Code, or have heard about the Culture Code? Yeah, I believe Neil has spoken about this yesterday as well. So this is kind of a link to that. It's related to that, and I'm actually going to deep dive into that and talk about how we actually do qualitative research with a very specifically anthropological lens, and how looking at culture actually helps us get right to the heart of cultural anxiety. So beyond what consumers are saying, beyond what they're actually doing, how do we get to right the heart of like what is driving them and what they're afraid of, what they actually really want. And today, because technology is half of life, we are also looking at technology and social media and all these other digital feeds to really inform this strategy of understanding the cultural code and the cultural subconscious. So the first question is, what is the cultural subconscious? I'm not sure if anyone's heard of this, but our own take on it is that it's something that is deeply driving consumers today, and what we're doing is also not looking at consumers as just consumers engaging with a certain brand, but as people who are affected and influenced by all sorts of things from history, geography, right down to today's social media influences. So just as a start, and just to contextualize everything I'm talking about and our own view of culture, let's look at this. So does anyone know what this is? Tissue paper, yeah. So if you look at the tissue paper, what does it make you think of? Please feel free to just shout your answers. I know it's a little bit far, but what do you think of when you see the tissue paper? Sorry? Dust, clean, hygiene, yeah. And now how many people, can I just have a show of hands, how many people here live in Singapore? Okay, so then everyone should be really familiar with this, because the point is that when we contextualize the tissue paper, what is this? Does everyone know what this is? Yeah, exactly, it's CHOP. It's a reservation system, right? It's a very organically created reservation system in a country that's kind of always short for time and in a rush. So for those that don't know, what this means is that if you go to any hawker center or any food center in Singapore, and if you see a tissue packet there, that seat is not empty, it is not yours. Someone will come, some auntie will come and hit you with an umbrella if you take that seat. So this is essentially an informal reservation system where people put tissues on the paper to say, hey, I've been here first, I need to go buy my food, but this seat is taken, do not sit here. So what this actually shows then is a larger cultural system of kiasu. So kiasu is a cultural trait that Singaporeans are associated with, and this is essentially the fear of losing out, right? So we hear this a lot. We say Singaporeans are so kiasu. They're always in long queues. You see them, if there's an offer, everyone runs for it. There is this intrinsic fear of losing out, and this intrinsic desire to be number one. And if we look at Singapore, then where does that come from? And if we look at, say, the Singapore myth of since independence, the story's always been told to Singaporeans that you're a small country, you're vulnerable, any misstep, you're gonna fail, you're not gonna survive. So basically in Singapore, becoming number one, succeeding, is correlated to survival. You can't just do well, you can't just be average, you can't just middle along, you've got to be number one. And somewhere deeply coded in every Singaporean is this idea that if I'm not number one, I'm not surviving. This is essentially death, a cultural death in some ways. So when I'm giving this example, what we're trying to say is that here, the cultural subconscious really goes beyond the observations that we see, even cultural observations. And it goes right to the heart of what creates a cultural system. And how can this be used? For example, this is level one, right? We all said we can see tissue papers. We know what tissue papers mean. Then we said, hey, this is a CHOP system. We recognize that there is a cultural symbol here. It is a CHOP system. And we look at brands like CHOP that have done really well. I think it's currently valued at USD 20 or 30 million. And it's done really well riding on this idea of a CHOP system. But when we get to the heart of the culture and we see that kiasuism and this fear of losing out is really there, then what we see is the birth of the tuition industry, which Singaporeans alone spend $1.1 billion annually. And this tuition industry and the Learning Lab, which I think is getting like 300 billion a year of in annual investments, it's actually tapping on that deep-seated cultural anxiety and that deep-seated culture code, which is kiasu, vulnerability, and I don't want to lose out on this. So what we see here is that really culture gives context and gives meaning to the things we see around us. And traditionally how anthropologists look at culture and the cultural subconscious is looking at history, looking at past behavior, and looking at present behavior. So while I am going to talk a little bit about these things, today we see that present behavior is also a lot about technology, and I'll try to bring in that angle too. So as an example, let's look at the code of luxury in China. Does anyone kind of have any opinions on what this could be? We've all seen, sort of the idea of the Fu Ertai, the rich Chinese flaunting wealth or being really, anyone want to give a shot at what this could be? No? Okay. Well, I mean, most people look at these photos and sort of say, hey, it's show off, it's flashiness, it's flaunting, right? Those are the kind of obvious things that come to mind when we first look at this. But now when we look at the cultural trajectory of China, we see how China, after the 16th century, actually had this long period of economic stagnation. So after the Qing dynasty, kind of all stagnated, almost went downhill. And then coming in the 19th century, 20th century, the country opens up, there's reformation. There's this big push for productivity. There is a big Confucian ethic of hard work and just sort of putting your nose to the grind, going at it. And what we've gotten is a kind of factory mode that everyone does associate China with. And it's almost like, the Chinese consumer, the Chinese person, didn't really have time to be a child. It was just all about work, producing hard work, getting the next step. And now that the economy is opened up, we actually see this big production of excess. It's almost like there's a realization, oh, hey, we've done it. We've worked really hard, and now that the world's opening up to us, there are options, there are things to do. It seems like there is just a big influx of abundance, and looking at this photo as well, it seems like abundance might be the code of luxury in China. However, when we then look at technology, we look at social media, we look at what all the rich kids of Chinese Instagram, of Chinese WeChat and Weibo are doing, we actually see more images like this. So I think it's a bit small, but what you see is essentially like multicolored designer bags, all in one pile. We see lots of champagne bottles put together. We see lots of shopping bags stacked together. And if you look at these images, what we see is actually, besides volume and plenitude, which is abundance, we also see this idea of modern toys. It's candy-colored wares. It's this idea of, I can't just have one, I need to have like 1,000 there to show. And what we then realize is that the code is actually not abundance, which technically kind of is a code for luxury anywhere, but play, which is a very specifically Chinese code, because looking at the history of hard work and Confucian ethic, and then getting into excess and opening up. And now the Chinese consumer is saying, hey, I didn't have a childhood in a way. I didn't get to play, but now everything's opened up. This is what we hear Chinese consumers saying. The previous generation, they just worked so hard. They were just trying to survive. Now everything is about enjoyment and excess, and really the world is my playground. So, what's interesting about this is that everyone knows the stereotype of the Chinese tourist, right? So everyone says, oh, the Chinese tourists, they go to Paris, they go into this shop, they grab all the bags, they don't wait in queue, they want to show off that they can buy so much. And often our own cultural bias makes us think, oh, that's just rude. It's, people use the word uncivilized even. People complain about this on the internet a lot. But when you look at the culture code of luxury in China, when you look at the historical trajectory and the fact that the code is actually play, now you look at it in the paradigm of them being in a playground. The entire world is a playground. Those shops are a playground. It's a new world. And when you know that the code of luxury in China is play, then the way we design for luxury in China, the way we design shops for luxury in China, the way we communicate luxury in goods in China, it's no longer just about, oh, gold, status, and this and that, but we can go actually much deeper than that and say, how do I bring childlike elements in this? How do I bring this sense of freedom and fun? So this is one example of how culture meets technology and really gives us this very essential, deep-rooted heart of the code of luxury in China. So today, as a kind of mentioned briefly before, culture has traditionally been looked at as history, feeds of history and culture and geography and politics. We look at economics. all those things give us a kind of code that's static, it's unchanging, it's informed and coded the way we see the world, perceive the world, behave. And then what we have today is technology, and the example I've used here is social media, but of course it goes much, much more beyond that. We have Instagram as a feed, we have Facebook as a feed, we have Snapchat, and really the internet is just a repository of consumer data out there, not just in terms of what they're saying about brands, but in terms of their own actual behavior. And you know, as people begin to live their lives online more and more, that is actually a reflection of their life. It's no longer just about what they're doing in the shops and what they're doing at home, watching TV and all that, but also about what they're doing online and how they perform and behave there. And the internet is essentially then a trail of consumer footprints and data that we can use and follow and to understand concepts such as beauty, such as motherhood, such as family. All those things are, are kind of uploaded already. So that's there. So I just have two other examples to show how technology meets cultural codes. And I think this is interesting because I think yesterday there's already some kind of talk about the cultural beauty code. So everyone should be kind of familiar with how that works. So the starting point here is, you know, everyone knows Brazil, everyone knows Korea, everyone knows about plastic surgery in these two countries, right? That's a popular association that these countries have. So the question is then, why are Brazil and Korea so into plastic surgery? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts. What do you think they're actually trying to seek? So I guess the usual answers would be things like perfection. They're looking for perfection. They're looking for to be beautiful. You know, that seems to be the case. But actually, culturally, there would be very different cultural motivations behind this. And now let's again go one by one and see how it actually comes through. So we look at Brazil. Brazil has traditionally been a very diverse place, right? Lots of diverse racial types. And talking about the history of Brazil, we had the Amerindians, then we had the Portuguese, and then we had the Europeans. And if we look at the history books of Brazil, what we actually see is this essential cultural panic that comes up at some point where there's a lot of intermixing, there's a lot of interracial marriages and mingling, and there is actually a physical fear that, that the race is getting degenerate. So now, ignoring those overtones of racism from the past, it was a very different era then, we see that this idea of beauty and this idea of actually improving your stock is something that was always ingrained in Brazil. And what they did then was actually to mate with more European partners. And this whitening of the stock was actually seen as a very good thing. I mean, at that point, intellectuals of that day was actually saying, this is great, you know, this is about escaping the infiltration of new doses of Mongolian blood, and we're actually improving the stock of the nation. So there was a very sincere and wholehearted belief that beauty, in many ways, reflects almost the health of a nation. And today, when we look at Brazil, we see plastic surgery clinics actually offering plastic surgery for free. It's almost like beauty is a right, and it is still a sign of a nation's racial improvement. So that's the history of Brazil when it comes to beauty and plastic surgery. And then today, when we look on social media and we look at you know, social media uploads of Brazilians who believe that they're uploading something beautiful, what we see is this influx of like photos that are all sunny, bright. They're all the photos actually focus on the body shape, the curves, and there is basically this attempt to convey the sense of vivaciousness and vitality. So if we even look at the word for the post-plastic surgery word in Brazil, it's actually getting the sarado body. And this sarado body actually refers to the cured body. So we see how plastic surgery here again is being thought of in the form of a medical cure. And what we see also is this big attempt to correct age, correct physical defects, and sculpt that perfect body. So when we bring the two together, what we see culturally in history in Brazil and what we see today in social media, what we see on blogs talking about plastic surgery, what we see then is that it's not about perfection, it's actually about health and fertility. It's as basic as this. Beauty was always a survival, an indication of survival. It's always an indication of constant stock improvement, racial improvement, and it's as basic as something like health and fertility, because this shows that you know, your nation's racial stock has improved. So now let's look at Korea, because Korea actually comes from a very different point of view. So if we look at Koreans and plastic surgery, if we look at the history of Korea, what we see is a whole trajectory of historical trauma, right? So there's actually been imperialism. There was the Japanese that were in Korea, and that the point of that is that they actually left a very deep imprint, a sense that, okay, we're culturally inferior. Even though we're all Asians, kind of have similar facial features, we're culturally inferior. And then with American imperialism, what we got was a deeper sense of not good enough, which is not just cultural inferiority, but physical inferiority. So if we look at the history of plastic surgery, it actually began in Korea, where aesthetic plastic surgery was used after the war. And an American surgeon actually was sent to Korea to go and reconstruct the war bodies. So what he did was, he said he looked at the Korean face, the Korean body, and he said, actually, you know, there are lots of things to correct here. It's also about the single eyelid. There are actually documents of him writing letters and saying the single eyelid makes Koreans look lazy or sneaky. So there is a lot of, you know, cultural judgment there. And that surgery was actually seen as something that was meant to reform and make better. If we look today at technology, again, I think it's again very interesting to examine the words used around plastic surgery in Korea. Here it's actually called reforming surgery. And blogs actually say things like, the feeling is that if you can look better, you should. So it's not about trying to stand out and be the most beautiful, but it's just that you're trying not to look bad. So you're trying not to bring shame and embarrassment to your friends. So people say, if I don't have plastic surgery, then I'm going to bring shame to my friends. And if we look at the kind of images that are uploaded on social media, and of course we see this very commonly in K-pop bands, there is a kind of look of visual uniformity. There is an attempt to blend in instead of standing out. And what we see is also big security in numbers and uniformity. So bringing this together then, the code of beauty in Korea is actually about leveling up and fitting in. It's not really about standing out and saying, I want to be the most beautiful person of all. It's just saying, I merely come from a place where I've been made to feel inferior, and this is just helping me level up. So when we look at the two, and we look at how technology and culture come together, we see how discussions of beauty are actually so different in the two countries, even though plastic surgery might be the observed form of achieving beauty. But look at Brazil, where they constantly have pageants for the best bum. What is the bum? At the end of the day, the body, the bum, these are signs of fertility, signs of health, right? That's what it quietly signifies. And if we look at Korea then, we see all the images of Korean beauty pageant queens actually conforming to a very similar uniform code of beauty, which is, hey, we all have achieved this together. We have achieved that perfection together. It's all about leveling up. And so now I guess we might say, then how can we use this? If we look at this, through the lens of traditional research, we would always have asked the consumer, what do you want from beauty, right? We ask them directly, what do you want from beauty? People will say, why do you do plastic surgery? They'll say, I want to transform, I want to look beautiful, I just want to be better, I want to feel better. But this modern conversation tends to get a bit static because there are only so many words people can use. No one, I mean, it's not like you ask someone, why do you want to be beautiful? And they say, oh, it's because I want to be healthy. It doesn't come right directly like that. Not everyone can even access their own cultural subconscious. And if we look at the behavior, what we see is face and body modifications in the form of plastic surgery. So on the surface, it all seems the same, but when we look at the cultural subconscious, then we see that an attitude of beauty towards health versus leveling up is actually hugely different. And this, of course, changes the way we talk to them as brands, the way we communicate. See, if we talk about perfection, if we talk about improvement or sexiness, we're missing the mark because it's actually about health and usefulness and vitality in Brazil. In the same way we look at South Korea, often people think beauty is about standing out or power or recreation. Actually, it could be just about fixing flaws. It's about blending in. It's not about power, it's actually about empowerment. So therein lies the very subtle difference that, you know, understanding the deep-coded cultural subconscious and culture code can actually do. Because we're coming from the point of view of what's the big cultural insecurity and anxiety in this culture and in this market. So then again, we look at like brands that communicate in both these countries in terms of beauty, we see very different codes. Look at Brazil. We see this whole, in visual communication, beauty brands actually tap a lot on the gold look, gold highlights, this idea of the sun and warmth and the myth of creation, basically. We look at concepts and they talk a lot about inventing yourself and saying that basically you have the power to create and to be born again and to renew. And even the formats here, we see lots of smooth and natural curved lines, oil formats with light textures. So this is just one example of saying this is how we can apply this, from communications to the visuals, to the brand, to the messaging. This knowledge of the cultural subconscious coming from both technology and history can actually really powerfully inform this. And we look at a difference in Korea again. What we see is an adherence to uniform beauty codes where there is a standard beauty template to be filled. There is actually this very simple and pastel-like and Jeju, almost Jeju kind of look aesthetic going on, and this idea of simplicity, purity, I'm not going to stand out in any negative way. I'm just going to sort of lie back and be a bit innocuous, but be beautiful enough to blend in. So this makes it, so knowing this really makes, if you look at the aesthetic, it's just so different. And when we began this conversation and we said, what does beauty mean in Korea? What does plastic surgery mean? Everyone sort of thinks, it's the same. It's all looking for perfection, right? Everyone looks for perfection. But perfection really is kind of different in both cultures. They look at it very differently, and it really shows through and can be a very powerful tool in brand strategy and communication. So today, what we're actually doing with this method and this approach of using an anthropological lens for everything is really looking at that in terms of cultural semiotics. So we can say things like, what does the family mean in this culture? We look at it from both history, we look at it from the point of view of what people are uploading and talking about when they talk about the family. We're doing this for digital ethnography, so it can be anything as abstract as what does smooth mean in China, and we can deep dive into that and say, hey, there are actually like so many other ways of looking at this concept because you haven't looked at philosophy, you haven't looked at the way people are actually coding this visually online. We look at brand semiotics, so this is looking at the brand itself and the category, looking at advertisements, looking at brand assets, logos. And of course, we're now using this a lot for design thinking as well, because at the end of the day, all this ties together and saying, okay, now we have great insights, but they are intangible. How do we make them tangible? How do we now get the right design principles for all these codes? So all this kind of comes together, and we're doing very interesting work in this space right now. So, so I hope this talk has sort of given you an insight into how we're looking at anthropology and design and this very interesting space in between to really approach consumers in a fresh way and really get under their skin in a way that I think is quite powerful. Thank you.